This is Andrew Stotz of Stotz Investment Research. I'm looking at the cash levels on balance sheets of companies by sectors. And in this case, I find that the infotech companies or sector have massive amounts of cash. So the question I'm asking is how much cash is held at companies in various sectors across the world? Well, let's take a look at it. First of all, we know that the global cash levels, cash as a percent of assets, right now is about 11%. We've also gone through the fact that the US used to be really low, but now it's got up to the global average. So let's take a look at what we see by sector. Now I've grouped sectors into three different groupings. The first is sectors with extremely high cash level, that's one, infotech. Then sectors with high cash levels, and then sectors with low cash levels. I've also separated by global versus US. So the global does include the US. It's not non-US, but it's just the global. And then you see the US. In the US, there are some differences. For instance, if we can see infotech companies have even more cash, 27.8%. Or if you go all the way down to the bottom and you look at utilities, what you'll see is that utilities companies in America have only 1.3% in cash. We'll look at that in just a second. So let's rock through these based upon extremely high and low cash levels. So before we do that, let's also think about the changes. So I looked at the period, the late 90s from 1995 to 2001. I took the average cash level of that sector from that period. And then I looked at the last 7 years, 2009 to 2016. So it wasn't based upon any one year. It was a combination of years in both groupings to see whether the cash levels for a sector went up or whether the cash levels went down in the forward years. So what I've done is shown you just two sectors that had small changes, almost no change. Energy, basically about 5.5% cash over 20 years or so. Healthcare, same thing, 14 to 15% cash. Wow, those are steady. Now one is low, meaning energy, and one is high, meaning health. Now let's look at the ones that had the largest change. You can see that telecommunications went from 5.7 to 7.9, and utilities went from 2.7 to 5.4. Now, I would say that those telecommunications and utilities really is because more and more global companies have come into that universe. So for instance, telecom companies are more of a utility in the US, so they are required to pay out excess cash as dividends, whereas in Asia particularly, telecom companies have gotten a lot bigger and they hold more cash. And also utilities, same thing. Utilities in the US is so low in the amount of cash because they're heavily regulated, whereas in Asia the cash levels are much higher. So many more utilities companies have come into play. Now let's look at the same exact thing, but this time just for the US. So what's happened in the US? The smallest change was in the real estate and utility sector. They stayed about the same, about 5.5% and about 1.5%. And the biggest changes came in consumer discretionary, which went from 4 to 9.5. Well, discretionary meaning people can stop spending on those things so they can be very volatile, like cars and things like that. After the 2008 crisis, a lot of these discretionary companies really tried to rebuild their balance sheets and rebuild cash. So I think we see some of that there. And then there's material sector that went from 3.4 to 8.1. So let's just take a look. Here we start with the extremely high cash levels, and that's the information technology sector. And this has gone from a cash level of about, let's say, 15 to 20% now to about 25%. And US tech companies are just way ahead of the others as far as having a lot of cash on the balance sheet. Remember, they don't have a lot of physical assets, so cash is the main thing. Plus, they've had great access recently, in particular, to the IPO market or to the capital raising market, let's say, for startups. All right, let's look at the group that is high cash levels. So first one is the healthcare sector. Again, a very high and stable sector. The next one is consumer discretionary, where you can see globally consumer discretionary companies have risen quite a bit in the levels of cash. So it's been a pretty good time across the world over the last, let's say, 10 years for these consumer discretionary companies. So they've accumulated a lot of cash. Next one is industrial companies, which are now across the globe are at about 12% versus the global average of about, let's say, 11 or so. But you can see that the red line, the U.S. industrials, have been struggling, and the last couple of years have been tough. Now, generally, I'm going to equate cash levels with profitability. It's not always the case, but I'm assuming that when companies are making a lot of cash or making a lot of money or profit, they have more option to hold that as cash. Next sector, real estate sector, has a high cash level, but if you look at the US, it's massively volatile and it's low, but in the rest of the world, it's high, or let's say in line. High cash levels, consumer staples. Well, consumer staples have just been doing really well, particularly in Asia, and we can see in the US they've just been rebuilding their cash levels. They're still below the global average, but what we can see is they've improved quite a bit in the US. Now, let's talk about low cash level sectors. The materials sector, in particular in the US, we can see materials is now down to about 7.5% of cash, whereas we can see globally all companies at about 11%. Telecom companies. Well, the telecom companies have a relatively low level of cash. There's an exceptional item in there in 2013, which I haven't looked into to see what that is. Now, it could be that there's an error in my data and I've got to go look for that. But based upon what we can see that it's been rising a bit. But if you look at it over a long period of time, particularly in the US, telecom companies are much more regulated than in the rest of the world. And that's why you see a cash level about 3.5% there. And then there's the energy sector, where we see whether it's global companies or US companies in energy, they keep their cash levels pretty low. I would think that energy companies also, they have opportunity to make a lot of money, so we can see the period when oil prices were going very high, they accumulated a lot of cash. But the fact is that they have a lot of access to funding, so I suspect they don't need to keep cash so low. And then there's the utility sector. In the US, it's always low, about 2%, 1.5% cash. And we can see in the rest of the world, it's about, let's say, 5%. So US utilities companies are usually required to pay out excess cash and raise funding just for projects. So again, we've looked at the cash levels by sector. We can see the infotech has an extremely high level of cash. That's always been the case, but it's extra high right now. We can see 5 sectors that are high cash levels and then 4 sectors that are low cash levels. I hope that helps you to think about the cash on the balance sheet now and going forward, particularly when you're forecasting the value of a company. Have a great day.